NK News has launched a new app that makes staying updated on all things North Korea easier than ever. The app gives access to the latest articles so you'll never miss a breaking story. It's fast, convenient, and designed with readers in mind. Our team is dedicated to bringing you the most accurate and insightful information about North Korea, with content and analysis unavailable elsewhere. Don't delay, download the NK News app from Apple's App Store or Google Play and stay connected with the latest North Korean news and analysis. The app also works with NK Pro subscriptions, offering full access to NK Pro content. Hello, podcast listeners. Welcome to the NK News podcast. I'm your host, Jacko Zwetsloot, and joining me today in the studio for a short chat is Anton Sokolin, my great colleague from NK News. Welcome and happy birthday, Anton.
Thank you very much, Jacko. Glad to be here.
It's great. I think it's been at least a month since I've had you on the show, so it's good to have you back. It's been a busy time in North Korea-related news. What would you like to talk about first?
Likewise, I'm also glad to be here. Thank you for inviting. It's been over a month, and we have plenty of events happening on the Korean peninsula. And, well, probably the most discussed topic would be the satellite launch, right, that we had last week.
Mm-hmm.
You already covered it with my colleagues, but still we have quite several developments around this issue.
Right.
We could talk about that, for example.
Yeah, Kim Jong-un says he's seen some photos.
Exactly, yeah, that's an interesting development, isn't it? For example, he said that he saw Rome, he saw the White House, and he also saw several, I think, air bases. I think one in Guam.
Okay, so basically he's like somebody who has just discovered Google Earth for the first time and is virtually flying around the world. Oh, look, there's Rome, there's the Vatican, there's the White House, there's an airbase. What extra value could he have from the photos that he's got?
It's actually good that you mentioned it because indeed it reminds me using Google Earth.
Yeah, for the first time,
For the first time, right?
Yeah.
Toying with it. At the same time, in terms of efficacy, I am not so sure if, they haven't released any photos yet,
so we haven't seen what the resolution is,
So
right?
they just claim that they saw those objects, right, or cities, whatever, but we haven't seen any photos, no proof. And at the same time, we are seeing South Koreans, of course, saying that, casting doubt on the efficacy of this satellite and the quality of those pictures. So we're not actually even sure how good they are or whether they do provide this, high quality resolution to look into this object.
Right. Now, South Korea is planning to launch its own satellite. Is it tomorrow?
I think, yes, by the end of the month, they said.
Well, today's the 29th, so that's tomorrow.
Right. And we are seeing, right, so that basically SpaceX is going to take their satellite.
That's Elon Musk's company.
Right, into orbit. And there were talks about this race going on between North Korea and South Korea, who's going to do it fast. And of course, we can say that North Korea kind of beat them to the gut, but at the same time, in terms of, again, efficacy and in terms of use,
right.
I think South Korea has slightly better chances of getting slightly better pictures, maybe, and actually get some use out of that satellite in orbit, right?
I mean, the best way for North Korea, I guess, to sort of prove its mettle without releasing an actual photograph would be if they said, this is the license plate number of the car that was parked across the road from the White House yesterday. Something like that, like some image that you could only detect with very, very high quality cameras. That would be good.
Actually, good that you mentioned that because I think they hinted at something like this. I'm not sure exactly. I can't really, don't quote me on that one, but I think they mentioned that they saw certain warships marooned at certain bases, the U.S. actually warships. And that could be interesting because it could be quite an indicator. Well, we still need to see whether those are the ones that are actually marooned in those bases. But
now, marooned is are you sure marooned is the word here? Because marooned, I think... birthed, because marooned is abandoned or
all right, my apologies, birthed.
Okay.
Yes, probably
Shipwreck?
that would be the correct term.
Okay.
Yes, birthed at those ports and so on. So if that matches, that could be a good verification thing,
Yeah, and then, the next step would be to read somebody's text from satellite. This is the SMS you got from your wife or something.
Well, if they directly quote Biden's speech from the White House, that would be something, right?
Well, no, because we all get that. That's released on the website.
Right, yeah. Sure.
Just get that off the internet.
Yeah.
All right. Anything more on the satellite story?
I think you covered it all, but we've seen also this speech by the North Korean representative to the United Nations, right? And basically he refuted all the accusations, because there were certain accusations in the first place, right? Condemnation that, the satellite launch was in breach of international sanctions.
Right.
But again, when we're talking about this space exploration, that's not the issue here. Because every nation has a right to explore space, but the issue is whether you're doing it using ballistic missile technology.
Yep.
And that is the main issue here. And at the same time, there is another issue, is that whenever you are planning this satellite launch, you have to notify the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, and aviation authorities as well. But in our case, in the case of North Korea, last time the DPRK did not notify these authorities, but did pass on a warning message to the Japanese Coast Guard.
Right.
And that is not really sufficient enough.
Not sufficient. And they launched the rocket a day earlier than their period that they announced.
Exactly, and failed.
So, okay.
Yes, and of course, the North Korean representative refuted all the condemnations, said it's North Korea's sovereign right to explore space, saying that 5,000 satellites are spinning around the Earth, and why can't we have one?
Why can't we have one? Right, yeah. Now, also new developments this week. Things are happening on the demilitarized zone between the two Koreas as a result of North Korea deciding, after South Korea has been talking about it for a long time, but in the end, and South Korea did suspend some parts of the comprehensive military agreement in reaction to the launch of the satellite, but North Korea said, you know what, the whole thing, forget about it. It's all off, right?
Right, good that you mentioned it. Shout out to my brilliant colleague Ivan Bremer, who covered this. He actually discovered the guard post being reinstalled, but North Korean guard post reinstalled alongside the DMZ.
Right, he went up to the border and saw it.
We can't really disclose our sources.
He has his own satellite, and somehow he saw it.
He has his own ways.
Yes, ways and means. Okay.
Right. So we're seeing that North Korea is reinstalling those guard posts,
which they took down. 2018, 2019, 2018. As a result of the CMA.
As soon as they signed this comprehensive military agreement, which is called military agreement, but the actual aim of the agreement was to reduce military tensions, right? By actually withdrawing troops from the militarized zone, demilitarized zone,
making it more demilitarized.
Exactly, making it more demilitarized. That makes sense, and reducing the number of outposts, guard posts. But now we are seeing that actually the guard posts are reinstalled and they are manned with actually soldiers carrying guns, and it is a sign, obviously, of I think I read it into this as a sign of a new escalation going on. And as you mentioned, it happened shortly after both countries decided to scrap the deal, the military agreement. As you mentioned, South Korea started slowly by partially actually scrapping certain parts of the deal, but then North Korea got extremely pissed off and just let's take the whole deal out of the table.
Yeah. Wow. And as you say, this is a potentially new escalation, and it leads to the possibility of things like cross-border shootings, even if by accident, right? Sometimes it happens, you're standing there looking through a window with your finger on a trigger. You might get a bit sleepy, your finger might pull a trigger. These things have happened across the demilitarized zone over the years, and suddenly you have a breach of the armistice.
Truly so, right? It's a very dangerous place. It's military people.
Right.
Of course, anything can happen. Of course, it could lead potentially to new tensions, and we're going to see more, because especially I think what's interesting is that we need to remember how Kim Jong-un was actually pointing at South Korean military facilities on the map, right? So quite recently, a few months back, during his military meeting with top military brass. And, it's kind of troubling a bit with these developments when these tensions rise again when South Korea also is about to reinstall those guard posts on the southern side.
So that's the response.
We're already hearing this sort of news. It's not confirmed yet, but I'm sure it is going to be confirmed soon. And, well, it can't really lead to anything good, in my opinion. And if we're seeing Kim Jong-un taking a very hard stance on towards the south, well, it's very troubling, isn't it?
This is not what we wanted to see. All right. Anything else you got for me today?
We also had elections going on in North Korea. We could talk about that. It was pretty interesting. I think it was a little bit overlooked because we had a missile launch, we had a satellite launch, we had this military agreement deal being scrapped, so many things going on. And obviously, whenever we hear elections in the context of North Korea, what comes up to mind is sham elections, not really properly conducted elections. And of course,
what kind of election was this? Was it a nationwide election for the what do you call it? The People's Assembly, or?
I think it was a lower level elections, county levels, townships, and so on. So people were electing their representatives.
Right.
And usually, for many years, North Korea was known to conduct one candidate elections.
Yep.
But this time they slightly changed it. They tweaked the election process and allowed two candidates now. So at certain townships and certain municipalities, let's call it like that.
Right, so people actually could choose one candidate or another.
Yes, and the turnout was pretty good. I mean, of course, in North Korea, the turnout is great all the time, like over 96%.
Yeah.
So that is great.
Hang on, in cases where there were two candidates, were they both from the Korean Workers' Party?
Well, that's a very specialized question. I'm not sure I can answer that, but I do think that it would be the case. But we know, right, that there's several parties in North Korea.
It's not the Chondoist Party.
Chondogyo, right? And there is also kind of quasi-democratic party, right? But at the same time, they are still, it's known for a fact that they are closely affiliated with the ruling party.
Right.
So talking about a real power dynamics there, it would be, I think, premature or a little bit naive. So
right, because both of the candidates, if there are two in any township, would have been through some kind of approval process.
It feels like that.
Right.
It feels like that because before it used to be just one candidate, pre-approved candidate, and now it seems like it would be just two. It doesn't. I don't think that it really leads to this liberalization of the process, or that North Koreans get more chance of electing their own beloved representative. But at the same time, my colleague Martin Weiser pointed out that there is a quite high percentage of abstentions. And and also,
so people going into a voting booth, but not necessarily writing a name or ticking a box, just turning it in empty.
Right.
Oh.
That or actually voting against, right? So voting against certain candidates, preferring not the mainstream candidate, and that's interesting because it shows that there is at least some on a very low level, there is a certain election process and a certain engagement of people. So and people try to find their representatives. So maybe there is even some trust in those representatives that they're electing. Maybe some certain hopes are associated. But again, speaking about mass phenomenon, well, I would say it's very naive. It would be quite premature.
So has Martin written a story about that for us? I
think he is going to cover it, but please check his articles on this election reform, on the elections, this primaries-like process.
Right.
And
Yeah, great. Listeners, you'll find those stories, of course, at NK News. This is very interesting that North Korea is having an election at this time. We in South Korea will be watching we'll be watching South Korea's own National Assembly elections just, 5 months from now, coming up in April. That's always an exciting time.
It is an exciting time. It's going to be a pretty interesting race.
No indication of where that'll go yet. Well, thank you very much, Anton, for coming and filling us in on these three big stories this week.
Thank you for inviting. Always a pleasure to be here.
And listeners, stay tuned because after this break, I have an interview with Lieutenant General Andrew Harrison, who is the Deputy Commander of the United Nations Command.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Imagine having the most wide-ranging news, analysis, and opinion on North Korea at your fingertips. Sounds great, right? Well, it's possible with NK News. They publish a truly diverse selection of unique articles every business day and provide you with valuable newsletters and alerts. Opinion writers and journalists include regular podcast guests like Andrei Lankov, Jongmin Kim, Chad O'Carroll, Colin Zwerko, Niels Weisensee, Peter Ward, and Shreyas Reddy. And because I know you'll love the product as much as I do, here's something special for you. Use the code PODCAST to get a $100 discount on your subscription. Redeem this podcast-only special today by visiting nknews.org/discount. That's nknews.org/discount. So what are you waiting for? Sign up for NK News today and get ahead of the headlines on North Korea. Okay, this interview was recorded on Friday, November 17th, 2023. Joining me here in the studio today is Lieutenant General Andrew Harrison, who is Deputy Commander, United Nations Command in Korea. He has had a distinguished military career with tours in, amongst others, Northern Ireland, Sierra Leone, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Thank you for joining me today, Lieutenant General Harrison. I understand you've held positions, also, as well as your field career, you've held positions at the Ministry of Defence and at NATO, and then you became the Deputy Commander here almost 2 years ago in December 2021. And that stint is due to end soon. Have I got all that right so far?
That's absolutely right. And can I say, after following your work over the last couple of years, it's a pleasure to be here at last and be able to speak to you. So thanks for having me.
The pursuit has been long and graceful, and I'm glad to have you here in the studio. You're not the first non-American to hold the position of Deputy Commander at the UN Command, are you?
No. About 6 years ago now, General Wayne Eyre, the Canadian, who's now their Chief of Defence Force, he was the first non-American deputy commander, and then Admiral Stuart Mayer, and the Australian, followed Wayne, and I'm lucky enough to be the third.
So this is sort of an ongoing tradition now, I suppose, a new tradition, as you said, 6 years ago?
Yeah, it's the post is formally tied between Australia and Canada, but for complex reasons, General Milley, then as chairman in Washington, asked the UK if we could fill for one turn of the handle. And again, I was lucky enough to be the right person at the right place.
And these are always 2-year stints?
Yeah.
So could you describe the role and duties of the Deputy Commander of the UNC? What actually do you have to do?
Well, I mean, in the most simple terms, I deputise for the commander on all issues relating to the United Nations Command. The boss, General Paul LaCamera, he has responsibilities across 3 commands: the United Nations Command, the Combined Forces Command, which is the ROC US Warfighting Alliance, and the singular American United States Forces Korea USFK Command. So he wears 3 hats.
Not simultaneously.
Yes, simultaneously. And he will literally change the badge on his arm as he moves between meetings of those 3 commands, because they have different authorities, different responsibilities. And so it's a complex business. Fortunately for me, it's slightly simpler for me. I only have responsibility in terms of the United Nations Command.
Right. And the duties of the United Nations Command, as I understand it, is to make sure the war doesn't restart. Right? It is to keep the armistice.
In the simplest of terms, yeah. The mission is about the maintenance of the armistice. You know, the end state we, of course, all seek is peace and security on the peninsula.
Yeah.
But that is in action to our mission, which is about the maintenance of the armistice, obviously signed in 1953, and then tasks and missions as given by the US Command of the United Nations Command. So could expand into other areas, reinforcement into the peninsula from member states if needed. There are many aspects it could do in the future, but of course that depends on the authorities and the orders given by the commander.
Now, North Korea recently repeated its demand that the United Nations Command be dissolved. They call it a US-led multinational war tool. And that raises the question of just how much the United Nations Command is a United Nations organ. Now, I spoke recently with someone who works for a UN agency, and that person said it's a real open wound within the UN itself that the UNC is called the UNC while it is in fact under US leadership and doesn't have any reporting lines or budget or oversight to or from the United Nations. What do you say to that?
Well, the United Nations Command was mandated under the UNSCRs in 1950.
Hang on, for the listeners at home.
Yeah, the United Nations Security Council resolutions. So the United Nations voted for the formation of the United Nations Command. So it is, by the very fact of its existence, it would only be in existence in its current form if the United Nations Security Council had asked for it to be formed under American command. Mm-hmm. So in my mind, it's very clear that this was an incredible act of collective security that was put in place in 1953. And I think the context is really important here. This was only 5 years after the Second World War. The world was trying to develop a system that would prevent us going back into a horrific global conflagration like we'd had between 1939 and 1945. And so this was the first big test for that new system of the United Nations. And it succeeded. It got the vote through. And we know nowadays the challenge of getting a vote through the Permanent Five in the Security Council. It got the resolutions signed, the Security Council resolutions 82 to 85. It got those signed. And that led to the birth of this organization, which, to be honest, then represented a perspective that allowed the aggression of the North to be challenged in the war, in the 50 to 53 war.
And because those resolutions had no sunset clause, there was no, like this will only exist for 5 years and then be dissolved. It's still existing under those original Security Council resolutions.
Well, that's absolutely true. And of course, it can be argued that the war isn't over because we are only in armistice.
Right.
There is no permanent solution yet. Everyone wants a permanent solution. But at the moment, a bit like when the First World War ended, there was the armistice, and then that led to the treaty that solved the problem in perpetuity or until the next problem arose. But that's the position we find ourselves in now, where as the armistice expands through time, there is still a very strong role and a very strong function for the United Nations Command in order to enforce the armistice that was set up in 1953, and we've just commemorated the 70th anniversary of.
How's the relationship with the UN these days?
I think the relationship is fine as far as I'm concerned. I mean, there is constant communication between New York. There is the option for the commander to, at any time, pick up the phone and talk into UN per se. But I think there's a misconception that the United Nations Command is a sort of light blue beret-wearing organization that's set up under the United Nations Peacekeeping Operations Department, or now the Peace Operations Department. That PKO organization came afterwards.
Right.
And so we are unique. And in fact, I was reading the other day that there was an aspiration in those very early days that there would be a number of UNCs around the world in different theatres. But actually, the way the UN work, journeys change, and it moved direction, and the Peacekeeping Operations Cell was set up.
Now, can the United Nations Command be both consistent with its original mission while at the same time adapting to modern times and modern circumstances?
Well, it has to be. I mean, I think nowhere is the mantra true that if you don't change, you become irrelevant, or more true that, if you don't change, you become irrelevant. And the nature of warfare may rhyme, but actually the methodology and the way one operates changes on a weekly, if not daily basis. And of course, with technology and different doctrine and adjustments in threats, you have to be agile all the time in order to meet the challenges as they arrive. Otherwise you're on the back foot, and no one wants to be in that position in the military, that's for sure.
Because the armistice, as you've already mentioned, it's a 70-year-old agreement. This year we commemorated the 70th anniversary of the signing of that armistice, and that has some very specific clauses and things in it. But as you point out, I mean, many things there were no drones back then. North Korea didn't have a navy or an air force back then. So some things were just not taken into account, I suppose, when that document was written.
Yeah, and that goes back to the point that some of the challenges of the organization and the security it affords. Cyber wasn't really considered. Space was, right on the cusp of being developed, but hadn't really been effectively developed at that stage. I think the speed and scale of the information challenges was very different in those days. I suppose one could say that things have become more complex since then. And, we operate across many domains that aren't simply land, air and sea. So, it just means we've got to deal with that complexity and be more agile as we face threats across those areas.
Now, I'm glad I have you on the show this week, because if I'd had you on last week or 2 weeks ago, I wouldn't have been able to talk about this. This week, the Republic of Korea and 17 United Nations Command member states had their first ever meeting of defense chiefs. I'd never seen anything like it before. I think it's unprecedented. What brought this meeting about?
I think it's absolutely timely. It was initiated by the president, and it was an invitation.
President Yoon of Korea.
President Yoon through the Ministry of Defense, and so it's or National Defense, and all 17 member states were invited to attend, and it was just a fantastic show of unity and an incredible event.
What can you tell us about it? Why was it significant, and what did it achieve?
Well, I think it demonstrated a unified position on many of the issues, that countries were willing to put their representatives in the room to discuss their continued support to the United Nations Command. And we had, like I say, a joint statement that was produced, which clearly espoused the way the United Nations Command wants to move forward and demonstrated the unity that exists within those 17 member states. And those 17 member states come from all over the world. I think aside from Antarctic and the Arctic, there are member states from all continents across the world. They come from Southeast Asia, Colombia over in South America, Europe, this region. It's a diverse group of nations with a common aspiration, that peace and security on the peninsula, who are working hard together and putting their troops in harm's way in order to maintain the security that they fought so hard for in 1950 to 53.
Are there still troops from other countries here, not just the US?
Yeah, absolutely. I think about 11 countries still have troops directly supporting the United Nations Command. I might be slightly inaccurate, changes by the month, but it's about that sort of number. As examples, we have New Zealand troops who've been involved in the demining and the recovering bodies from the demilitarized zone.
Yeah.
We have troops that come in the maritime domain, the air domain, and on land. So there's a lot going on. And the demilitarized zone, which of course we have responsibility for, is an incredibly dangerous place. There are millions of mines and unexploded items of ordnance that still are up there. And sadly, there are many of our Chinese fallen and North Korean fallen in the demilitarized zone. So the recovery of those remains, leave no man behind, is really important to everyone who's served in any military around the world.
Now, the Republic of Korea is not actually one of the member states of the United Nations Command, but President Yoon called on this meeting. How does the Republic of Korea liaise with, work with United Nations Command?
Closely. I was with Republic of Korea officers last night. I think, I see them and work with them almost every single day. It's a very close and friendly relationship. And for me, the UNC membership is almost a moot point. They are the hosts of the United Nations Command. And I think it's really important that everyone knows that they have a very special relationship with the United Nations Command. And they also have representation within the command because they hold a general who is the senior member of the United Nations Military Armistice Commission, that organization that's exclusively set up for the responsibilities relating to the armistice. So there are already ROC soldiers and service personnel within the construct of the United Nations Command.
And that's really transformed over the last 70 years, right? I mean, when the armistice was signed in 1953, President Syngman Rhee wasn't ready to quit, and the army was ready to keep going north. And so, in effect, the UNC was there holding back both sides. And that's, over the years, the Republic of Korea has dropped that idea and are happy to simply stay here and discourage North Korean aggression.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty old, but 1953 was a bit before my time. But I've heard accounts of Syngman Rhee's perspective as to, the reasons why he would or wouldn't sign. But of course, in the end, the signatories of the armistice were the military leaders, and on both sides. So for me, I think it remains a historical question, which sadly we'll never probably get to the very bottom of now. What was his thinking behind his decision-making at that time? But as the Guinness Book of Records has noted, the armistice agreement is long-standing, has been very successful. And whilst there have always been flashpoints and there is always risk and danger, it has been incredibly successful over 7 decades. And again, I would never underestimate the tragedies that have occurred during that time. Lots of people have been killed, but we have never, thank goodness, returned to full-scale war like we saw between 1950 and 1953.
I want to return to that point in a moment, but going back for a moment to the defense ministers' meeting that we had this week, do you expect that there'll be more meetings like it where multiple countries get together here in Korea to talk about things?
Personally, I hope so, because I've spent much of my career in coalitions, in large organizations, trying to uphold peace and solutions that maintain peace. And therefore, communication is critical to that. And so any opportunity where leaders can get together, explain their thinking, understand the rationale behind decisions that are being proposed or being taken, I think can only be a good thing. So I hope we will see more of them in the future.
I remember a few years ago, before you came here, when Donald Trump was president of the United States, that there was some concern that America might just cut and run from the Korean Peninsula, and Koreans became very worried about that. And I wonder whether this meeting this week could be an attempt to sort of future-proof the United Nations Command against a re-election by Donald Trump or someone like him.
Probably outside my lane. Yeah. I mean, if I get to talk about American politics, then things have probably gone badly wrong for me. But all we can say about the future is events happen. I think it was Neville Chamberlain who said, "Events, dear boy, events." That's what will happen. Right. And the only thing that we can guarantee is that things won't be the same in the future as they are today.
Now, you're an officer with actual battleground experience. What was it like coming to a place where the whole point is to make sure that you don't get any battleground experience and that no battles kick off while you're here?
Yeah, this is my 3rd tour in my career operating under the United Nations flag. So I've worked in the demilitarized zone between Iraq and Kuwait before. I have worked desperately hard across the world trying to maintain peace in very volatile and dangerous situations. Sometimes it's gone wrong and sometimes we've succeeded. I mean, from a personal perspective, I look back at some of the campaigns I've been heavily involved with and lost friends in, and I see the peace that has come since, and specifically looking to Northern Ireland and the Good Friday Agreement. I lived in Germany as a boy when the Berlin Wall still existed, and now there is a unified Germany. I was involved with the United Nations in Sierra Leone when rebels attacked Freetown and many thousands of people were killed. And the activity of the United Nations and individual countries brought peace to that country, which still exists. So I'm optimistic, and any day that isn't war makes it more difficult to return to war, because people get used to peace and they see the value of peace, and they can focus on looking after their families and prosperity and all of these things, rather than the awful destruction that inevitably follows any sort of return to conflict. So I, like many military and service personnel around the world, if you've seen war, you never want to go back to that situation, and you realize the value of peace. So I'm passionate about this job because peace is so important, and we must never lose sight of that. There can be nothing worse than returning to a conflict that kills thousands and thousands of people.
I don't know who it was, the author, the original person who said the quote, "If you want peace, prepare for war." I think that goes back to the ancient times.
Yep.
I think it's from Latin or something.
Yep.
Is that something you ascribe to in terms of how we make sure that a peace is lasting and durable, as you've got to be ready in case things go the other direction?
Yeah, I do believe that. And I think that phrase has been talked about a lot in the last week or so. And I think that's absolutely right. If leaders who have malevolent intent see an opportunity because of a weakness of others, then history shows us that on occasion they seize that opportunity. And therefore, strength deterrence through strength, I think, is absolutely appropriate. And General Camera always talks about the importance of readiness. And what is the point in having a force that can defend a country if it's not ready? You may as well not have that force. So I think you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Well, that neatly sets up my next question. Can you walk us through some of the differences of being on a mission of deterrence versus being on a mission of actual engagement?
The focus is almost exclusively on defense. I mean, and I'll come back to the reason I don't say exclusively, but it is about maintaining the armistice. And I can't stress that enough. All the United Nations Command focuses on is maintaining that armistice and how best to do that. And we have things like we conduct investigations to any incidents or alleged incidents on both sides across the demilitarized zone. We have assurance, high quality assurance delivered through the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, which
the Swiss and the Swedes.
Exactly, the Swiss and the Swedes, who have an independence that is bestowed upon them by the commander to investigate incidents. We put reports in that explain what has happened and why it has happened. So there is a lot going on to maintain what has been agreed internationally in that armistice agreement. So it is the maintenance of the status quo and the prevention of escalation into potential conflict that is our exclusive exclusive mandate. Yes, we will practice in our drills, retaking a trench or some elements of that. But the big exercises we do, the Ulchi Freedom Shield and the Freedom Shield exercises at the moment, we ensure they are defensive in nature. And that, again, is very carefully monitored over the period of that training.
Okay, talking about the large-scale military exercises, in an interview with Yonhap News Agency in March this year, you talked about the Freedom Shield military exercise that involved both the Republic of Korea and US troops for 11 days, and you said that it was a routine training to, quote, retain peace with very tight oversight. Can you help our listeners understand why such exercises are useful, important, and not a threat to North Korea?
Well, it goes back to my point. If you don't have readiness, if you don't have interoperability, and remember, it isn't just the Republic of Korea and the US forces that exercise on those training events. There are other elements that can come in from the member states. It is about, does the radio from the Republic of Korean platoon commander talk to the radio of the American platoon commander, and how does that interact with a member state ship that's off the coast? And again, if readiness is as important as a weapons system, it's a bit like if you're not ready, then you may as well not have that weapons system. So we train in order to ensure that we are ready. And you'll be familiar with the mantra of the Combined Forces Command, which is we fight tonight. And it's exactly that. It is to demonstrate that we are ready for any eventuality at any time. And in my view, every defence force around the world should be training like that. Otherwise, it's simply a waste of money having those resources that could be spent on other things in those nations.
Now, in that same interview, you said, quote, in the early stages of an exercise, we look at the challenge to the armistice that might occur, and we always try and de-escalate back to a sort of pre-crisis position. If crisis turns to conflict, we're looking at how the sending states could operate together in whatever scenario. And I'm just wondering if you could say a bit more about de-escalating to a pre-crisis situation. How might that be done?
The problem with conflict, again, through 37 years of experience, is that if heads get hot, if there are decisions taken that don't think through issues, and I'm not saying this has happened in any particular case, I'm just saying if that occurs, then the risk of initiating activity that hasn't been thought through to the end can be really dangerous. I remember as a young company commander, my commanding officer would always say, think to the finish, because it's very easy just to step off in one direction because there's one feels there's a requirement for activity, but actually you step off in the wrong direction.
Right.
So we used to call it the condor moment, where you step back, have your cigar, think through, and then act. And I think that often gives the opportunity for de-escalation, and often allows investigation into the facts. Again, there's a phrase in the military that first reports of contact are always wrong.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in that initial battle in the information domain about what's happened, often that information is inaccurate. And if one acts on inaccurate information, there is a real risk that you make the situation worse. So I think de-escalation is always something we seek to do whilst we establish the facts as to what has actually happened.
What role does the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission play in exercises?
They provide oversight for the exercise. So they literally will sit in meetings, they will interview. I've been interviewed many times by the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, and they will make their own independent judgment about the nature of the training and then report on that. So they're embedded really in almost all aspects of the training, and the commander always gives them full access to what's going on.
So if they were, as North Korea alleges, aggressive, hostile towards North Korea, we would expect the NNSC to come out and say something?
Absolutely.
Now, how do you experience these exercises? What's your role in them?
So, as I described it earlier, the commander has a series of responsibilities rather than just focusing on the United Nations command elements. So I will be coalescing the information that relates to the armistice, that relates to United Nations Command member states, and that impacts on the capitals and nations around the world, who will, of course, have a huge vested interest in what is going on here. So that coordination function on behalf of General LaCamera and the communication back to member states is something that I focus quite heavily on.
Now, I recall reading in the past that North Korea was invited to send observers to exercises, but they never came. Do you know if they're still invited, or if they will be invited again in the future?
I don't know the answer to that question, to be honest. I don't know whether that's a standing invitation or was specific for a specific event. So I apologise, Jack.
No, it's okay. It was probably before you came here 2 years ago. Certainly during COVID, that wouldn't have happened. Can you recall your first visit to the Joint Security Area and the demilitarized zone when you were fresh to your role as Deputy Commander of the UNC?
Yeah, I think anyone who visits the Joint Security Area and the demilitarized zone will be left with enduring and powerful memories of that visit. And I think I regularly escort visitors into the demilitarized zone and the Joint Security Area. And I'm always reminded how stunning it is the first time one goes up there in terms of the impact it has on the psyche of those visitors. And I think for me, I was very conscious of the risk. You know, you can almost palpably feel the risk that exists there. And this was during the tail end of COVID, so it wasn't quite as it is now. But that was the first thing that struck me. The second thing for me was, as I looked over into North Korea, I think that in my mind there was a sadness. You know, there is a sadness that after 70 years, we are still in this position. And, you know, there are good men and women on both sides of that border. You know, there are parents and families and grandfathers and grandmothers who still live under a threat, under this tension. And again, having worked through my career on borders where these tensions exist, I was just sad. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to do our very best to try and reach a solution. Much of it sits outside the lane of the military, and I know our diplomats strive really hard and our politicians strive really hard to find a solution. But peace will come one day. One day peace will come. And I think that the harder we can work to bring that peace forward as quickly as possible, the better. And I just, you know, as I depart here, I just wish my successors, and I wish all those politicians and diplomats I've talked about around the world, I wish them the very best of luck in what is an absolutely critical job for the welfare of people across the peninsula, north and south.
During your time here, have you had any encounters with North Korean military on the other side?
I see them regularly. I mean, from many of the locations, the guard posts, the observation posts, and the static locations on the border, you can see Korean People's Army operating on the north and see civilians farming the land in the north. So thank goodness we maintain communication through the telephone line that exists. But I personally don't speak on that line, and I haven't had the opportunity to speak to any Koreans during my tenure.
I imagine they know
North
who
Koreans.
you are.
I don't know.
Right, they're probably looking at you through binoculars and saying...
They may be, yeah.
Have you been in Korea long enough working with the Americans that you now say DMZ rather than DMZ?
Well, there are a few lines that are important, and holding the DMZ line is important.
Very good. Okay. I years ago, more than 20 years ago, I wrote a thesis about the potential for Korean unification and looking at the unified Germany, where many in the East, they talk about how there was the wall, the physical wall went away, but the wall in the head remained, sort of the Mauer im Kopf in German. And I speculated that there might be a DMZ in the head in the future after a Korean unification, but that only works if you say DMZ. It doesn't work if you say DMZ in the head. There's no rhyme there at all. Okay, so you were Deputy Commander of the UNC at the time of the commemoration of the 70th anniversary, the longest armistice in the world, the Korean War Armistice. Can you share a couple of thoughts on just the longevity about that and what makes the situation both durable and lasting on the one hand, but also potentially fragile and not to be taken for granted on the other side?
Yeah, and firstly, I'd just like to pay tribute to the Ministry of Veterans Affairs and MPVA for their work in commemorating both the armistice and the end of war. I think it's just been amazing. And for those people who had the privilege of being down in Busan in July, I've just come from Turn to Busan, where I sat on a table and talked to veterans who'd been through the war, who'd seen Korea in that time, a desolate country that had been ravaged by war, and then come back to see the extraordinary country that is now the Republic of Korea. And
I should just point out to our listeners that Busan is where the UN cemetery is located. Yeah. That's why it's an important place to visit.
Yeah, over 2,000 of our fallen lie there, I think from 11 countries. Beautifully kept and unique, I think, as a United Nations cemetery. So, I can't praise enough Minister Park and the work that MPVA have done in maintaining the sacrifice of those individuals who came from 22 nations around the world and keeping their memory alive, because those families paid a price that no one will ever understand if one hasn't been through the bereavement of a family member in such circumstances. So that would be the first thing I'd say, well done to the government of Korea for remembering so beautifully our fallen and all the fallen of the war. Sorry, I lost the thread there slightly.
So I was hoping to get some thoughts on how it's remained durable, but at the same time, it can be fragile and we can't take it for granted.
There are, provocations, as many would describe them. And I think that risk always holds true. Last year, 75 missile launches. This year, 29 missile launches. ICBMs being, intercontinental ballistic missiles being fired. And there is always this sort of the shadow of the past that hangs over us that could lead to some resumption of hostilities. And of course, everyone will remember, almost everyone will remember the tragedies that were the sinking of the Cheonan, the shelling of Waipido Island, these incidents that happen over time. And I'm very proud that even with such challenges, even with such often fatal incidents, it hasn't returned back to full-scale war. And I think much of that praise must go to my predecessors in the United Nations Command and all of the forces who've been able just to allow time to de-escalate, to consider the risk of return to full-scale violence. And so we fortunately have had no major breaches of the armistice for a while. We have had no major missile launches for a while. And long may that continue. Long may that continue, because that does increase the volatility or demonstrate the volatility. It does increase the risk. So if something does happen, the first thing we will do is seek to understand what's happened and then allow great leaders to make well-considered decisions.
Can you say anything about sort of your own broad assessment of the current risk of renewed conflict?
I mean, there is always a risk of conflict. And, even when a conflict has been static for a long time, I mean, one only has to imagine how the people of the Donbass felt in 2014 and now with this renewed aggression by Russia in the last 2 years. One only has to look at how Gaza and the people of southern Israel have been impacted by a resumption of violence to realize that peace is precious and fragile. And, I use a phrase to my troops that war is coming, it's just when and where. Because sadly, one of the truisms of life is that war will happen. But the longer we can stop it from happening and the better the decision making before a resumption of violence, the less chance it will have of being cataclysmic, and hopefully we can avoid it totally.
Looking at the ongoing conflicts in the world today that you've already alluded to, can the success of the United Nations Command in holding back or keeping the conflict on pause here and holding back the belligerents, could that be repeated elsewhere in the world, such as in Ukraine or in Israel?
Well, I mean, I think I cite the two examples from my experience, the Northern Ireland, where we were able to hold a form of peace through the Troubles until the Good Friday Agreement was signed, that's led to an enduring stability and peace in Northern Ireland. I look to the demilitarized zone that existed between Kuwait and Iraq when there was still high tensions and the threat of Saddam Hussein, who was still in power in Iraq after the first Gulf War, prevent his return to violence into Kuwait during high tensions that people forget relating to oil drilling, etc. So I'm confident that United Nations Command and the troops that support United Nations Command are professional, they are very well trained, and I think we will hold the line.
Can you share with us some thoughts on the comprehensive military agreement between the two Koreas? I know that was signed well before you got here, but it's been a topic of some debate, and now there's a suggestion that it may in part have been, rescinded or retracted?
Yeah, I have. This is clearly a sovereign agreement between the North and the South. And therefore, whilst it impacts on the periphery in terms of United Nations Command troops in the demilitarized zone, the decisions that relate to it are decisions for the governments of the North and or the South. So that's absolutely in that lane and really sits outside my bailiwick on my responsibilities. So I'll see what happens with interest, and I'm tracking very carefully.
But in as much as it was an attempt to institutionalize a de-escalation, it was looked at the time as being somewhat hopeful. For me, who continues to live here in South Korea, I see that as being a bit fraught, that we now look at the possibility of that institution being removed.
Yeah, and these agreements are always put in place in the context of the time. And, there were some really powerful attempts to solve problems in terms of the sunshine policy, in terms of, the summitry that was involved the leadership of US, North Korea and South Korea. So everything has its moment in time, and whether it survives or not is really dependent on the circumstances that surround it. So we will see where it goes. I really don't have a view on this issue.
Because presumably it doesn't affect the work of the UNC too much, right? I mean, the maintenance of the armistice continues regardless.
Yeah, the mission will remain for the United Nations Command, the maintenance of the armistice. And that will continue until the United Nations Security Council says it no longer wishes the command to do that task. So the decision in relation to the United Nations Command is vested in New York and the United Nations General Assembly and Security Council. So that both the US command element and the troops on the ground dance to the tune of New York in that respect, rather than a national perspective from Seoul or Pyongyang.
Although whether we'll ever see a day when those 5 permanent members agree on anything again, given the current state of things, that's an open question. Now, during your last year here, one incident that's really come up on everyone's radar is that the Travis King unauthorized border crossing on the 18th of July 2023. How did you find out about it, and what can you say about it? How did it happen? How was it even possible?
How does something like that happen? In the end, we do not have a trench with an electric wire down the middle of the demilitarized zone on the MDL. And therefore, despite the best efforts of everyone involved, there have been defections north and south. And that sadly continues to occur. I think we have conducted an investigation. Lessons have been identified and will be learned. All I can say is I'm absolutely delighted that Private King has been returned. I'm very grateful he's been returned. And I think in terms of decreasing tensions, I think that's a really great move. And I'm very happy to all of those involved. It was an international effort, so that's good news.
Can you say anything about the mechanism of how it was handled between the UNC and the government of the DPRK?
I mean, I don't want to go into detail because clearly these things could or would be used in the future. So therefore, I don't think there's any great advantage apart from curiosity in going into the detail of how it happened. But I'll repeat, I'm just really, really pleased it has. And that's for Private King, for his family, and for everyone involved. Sometimes one doesn't want to think about what alternative outcomes could have been, but that's good news.
Yeah, for me, it certainly was surprising and unprecedented that he was handed back in the way that he was without there being some demands made by the DPRK side. Like normally, that's the kind of thing that goes on. But on the one hand, that was a great surprise, but it did seem to take quite a bit of time there. But what was it, July? About two and a bit months, I suppose?
Yeah. And in the grand context of things, I'm not sure that really matters all that much. The point is he's back, he's, healthy, and the situation has returned to what it was, and that specific issue has been completely de-escalated. And, in private to all those people involved, thank you. Thank you for people who made brave decisions probably and allowed that service member to go back to his family.
Now, since then, commercial tours to the Joint Security Area haven't restarted. Do you imagine they will, and will they be significantly run differently to avoid the same thing happening again?
As I say, an investigation's happened. Lessons have definitely been learned. And I would be optimistic that tours will restart. When and exactly how, and the mechanisms involved to reduce the chances of repetition of certain incidents, I think will be put in place. And I hope that can occur in the near future.
Was this the most unusual event to occur during your 2-year stint here?
I was in Japan when it happened, and I very rapidly came back to the demilitarized zone. But I suppose that it was surprising. It was very surprising. But if you consider the probably millions of visitors who've been into the demilitarized zone, then you look back on it and say, well, maybe I shouldn't have been surprised that something extraordinary happened. If you've got a repetition of something that's normal time and time and time again, then again, something's bound to change at some point. And then one has to think through all of those possibilities all the time. It's incredibly difficult on those young men and women who are up there day after day, consistently doing similar things, to react when something dissimilar, something abnormal happens. And, what those troops do and what they do in terms of sacrifice and duty, I think is worth people understanding. I've gone to hospital in the last 2 years and seen 3 soldiers who've been wounded, badly wounded, by ordnance that's in the demilitarized zone. People whose lives have been changed.
These are accidents, are they?
By accident or design, it really doesn't matter to that soldier. He's stepped on and a device has been initiated or whatever it may be.
Wow.
But some of those are life-changing injuries. For the soldiers who work with me, sailors, airmen, men and women, they spend 2 years in a country far from their own homes, often far from their own families, taking those risks under a United Nations flag in the service of peace. And I think, they should be continually praised for that sacrifice. I've spent a lifetime working around the world, and it's a privilege to do it. But it comes at a price. It comes at a price. I've spent 9 years away from my family, and it's not about me, but every one of those soldiers, whatever country they're from, if they're working in the United Nations Command, are paying a price for our security on the peninsula. And, God bless them is all I say, because they do a great job.
Is that kind of injury where somebody's either hurt by ordnance or a mine, is that an ongoing thing? Or was it unusual that, how many did you visited? 3?
3.
Is that par for the course? I mean, is that unusual for a 2-year period?
Well, I think it's, we sit here in beautiful Seoul and as the sun shines down on us, and it's very easy to imagine that this sort of peace is all around us. But the risk there is very real. There are millions of pieces of ordnance in the demilitarized zone that have not been cleared. And we have to patrol. We have to maintain observation. We have to understand what is going on in the demilitarized zone. So those young men and women have to take risk to do their job. And tragically, occasionally, that leads to injury. And all I ask is that people remember those soldiers who will be there tonight, tomorrow night, and every day until final peace is established.
What are you most proud of during your 2-year stint here, or most satisfied with?
In many ways, it echoes that last point. I'm incredibly proud of those young men and women. You know, some of them have never been outside their own country before they come here. To come to Korea is a privilege. It is such a beautiful country. It is absolutely unique. It is not well explored by the international community. So I'd had the privilege of coming here before, but for many people, it's the first time they come here. It's an incredible culture, but I'm immensely proud of what they do. And I think they get a real there's a sense of purpose. They understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. And if I had one message to go back is I hope their families understand, whether they're from London or Washington or Canberra, it doesn't matter, but they should know that these young men and women are just doing an amazing job at risk, almost always with a smile on their face and doing the very best they can. So, as I go back to my family, I will think about those young men and women.
Well, that's a great place to end our interview today. Thank you once again for coming on the show, Lieutenant General Andrew Harrison, Deputy Commander, United Nations Command.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you. Ever feel overwhelmed with the complexity of trying to understand what's going on with North Korea? Don't fret, NK Pro is here to help. Built on the strong reputation of NK News, NK Pro combines decades of experience with cutting-edge technology to offer the best in North Korea-related information. Here's the deal. You get daily analysis and exclusive news, along with amazing research tools that let you tap into a vast range of open-source North Korean information, such as state media search and data extraction, real-time ship and aircraft movement tracking, and A to Z directories of people, companies, and organizations inside and outside the company. Yes, you heard that right. NK Pro is perfect for those in policy, business, and research who need quality, reliable, and timely insights. It's not just about staying informed, it's about understanding the key signals that can change the course of the future. So why wait? Dive deep into the realm of North Korea with NK Pro and navigate the landscape like a pro. After all, knowledge is power. Interested? Visit nknews.org/professionals to claim your free 30-day trial of NK Pro. Once again, that's nknews.org/professionals. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our podcast episode for today. Our thanks go to Brian Betts and Alana Hill for facilitating this episode, and to our post-recording producer genius Gabby Magnuson, who cuts out all the extraneous noises, awkward silences, bodily functions, and fixes the audio levels. Thank you, and listen again next time.